So did Concord actually cost $400 million? I don't know for sure, but that's what's going around right now. Let's dissect the math and see if that's even possible. This is going to be pretty back of the envelope because I don't work for Fireworks Studios or Sony, so I don't have a look into the inside of their financials. If we start from a pure development perspective, we don't include any externalities, then the easiest way to look at this is from a pure staff month perspective. Could we have spent $400 million just on staff? That's not a perfect way to do the math because obviously you have other external factors, but it's a pretty good indication. If we can get even close, then it's at least possible that Concord did in fact cost $400 million. Fireworks Studios was founded in 2018. We keep hearing that Concord took 8 years, but I'm going to start this section of math assuming that significant spending only started in 2018. It went alpha on April 30th of 2023, which is also about when Sony bought them. And then it launched August 23rd, 2024. That means we have 63 months from start to alpha, and we have 15 months from alpha to launch. The reason why I'm using these two numbers is an additional piece of information that's going around is that $200 million had been spent up until alpha, and then an additional $200 million was spent after that. So let's see if we can make that make sense. I'm going to use a fully loaded staff month of $15,000. To be clear, that doesn't mean that the people working on the team were making $15,000 a month. This means that once you factor in all of their costs, I'm going to use the number 15,000 as to how much they cost. So this includes all of their supplies and computers, office space. Additionally, it would include any central resources that aren't factored into the team. So HR, both before and after Fireworks Studios was purchased by Sony, it existed within a larger organization. So there are people who are not directly working on the team, support staff and the like, that are still going to be factored into that cost. At first, when I was doing this modeling, I thought maybe 15,000 was going to be a little bit high, but Fireworks Studios is in Bellevue, Washington, which is a very expensive place. So actually, in reality, $15,000 for a fully loaded staff month might actually be low. But that's the number we're going to use and makes the modeling a little bit simpler. Again, to reiterate, this doesn't mean that the average dev at Fireworks Studios was making $180,000 a year. It means that once you factor in their health insurance and their office space and their chair and their computer and the HR person and the central staff and the C-suite, that it works out to $15,000. Pretty comfortable with that number. So if we use that number and we use 63 months from start to alpha and 15 months from launch to alpha, to get 200 million and 200 million, we have to have an average team size from launch to alpha of 212 people and an average team size from alpha to launch of 900 people. These are very big numbers. Let's start with this first one. Can we make that first 5 years of development make sense with an average team size of 212? Well, I made a chart, and it basically means that we start at 50 people on that first day, which is reasonable because, again, they existed within a larger organization. It's possible that they could have started with a team of some substance, especially given that there was some work happening before Fireworks Studios was even founded, supposedly. If this took 8 years, there was some work even before there. So for them to hit the ground running at 50 is actually quite plausible. Then they need to essentially add 5 people a month for the entirety of those 63 months, and they finish out at a 365 person team. That's pretty high for a team that is just at alpha. It's possible. I'm not sure how plausible it is, but it is possible, especially given what we're hearing about Sony seeing this as the future of Sony. and they went as far as to acquire the studio right around this point. So it is possible that Firewalk had a slightly smaller team, and then there was an internal team at Sony before the acquisition on top of it. So starting at 50, finishing at Alpha at 365 is possible. It's stretching plausibility, but I think it is possible. That means that we are basically spending about 13,000 staff months to get from launch to Alpha. That's really big, really, really big, especially since if we're going to do it entirely with staffing, we have to spend that much again from Alpha to launch. It is possible. Games like GTA spend more than this in terms of staff months. So maybe, does it make sense to have an average team size from Alpha to launch for that 15 months at the end of 900 people? That's actually quite possible. The rumor I heard on Starfield is that they had every single QA person at Microsoft testing that game for the last 4 or 5 months. That would be thousands of people on that team, just in QA. For a project that's seen as so strategically important, at least to some member of the C-suite at Sony, to a project that has that much political weight behind it, it is quite possible that if the project was seen as being in trouble, that it would draw in entire other dev studios in order to try to get it to launch. And as you got bigger and bigger and bigger, it would become less and less efficient. And the integration costs would become almost insurmountable. For each person you're adding, you're getting fractional staff benefit. I actually have more trouble believing that earlier number up to Alpha than the 900 from Alpha to launch. A project that is in trouble can get really big in an effort to get it over the finish line. So with those two numbers, 212 people on average up till Alpha and 900 from Alpha to launch, we get a ground total cost of about $400 million, $402 million. So it's possible if we do it purely through staffing with just a fairly simple ramp. Let's see if we can make this more plausible by injecting a couple of other costs. So if we keep everything the same in terms of dates, keep our fully loaded staff month cost the same, but we inject 3 additional costs. First thing is there's that 2 years before Firewalk Studios was formed, bringing us up to that 8-year development timeline. If we put $25 million into that cost bucket, so that would be about 50 people working for those 2 years, or some very high paid, more executive level people working on it for those 2 years, then that's $25 million we pull out of there. Additionally, once a project gets into, let's say, too big to fail, too important to fail, too necessary to fail, what can start to happen is that other costs from around the organization can kind of get pushed under the rug underneath the umbrella of this larger project. If you worked at Firewalk Studios on something that wasn't Concord, then there's a reasonable chance that your costs were being booked to Concord as well. If you worked within the Sony organization and you could tie yourself back to Concord through any means at all, then it might be possible for you to hide your costs inside of Concord, especially if the organization saw it as so important that it could do no wrong, it could spend as much as it wanted. It makes sense for you to hide as much of your costs in that bucket as you can so that you can continue working on the things you're working on. Typically, that's not going to be a huge amount of cost. You're not hiding hundreds of people. You're hiding ones or tens of people at most. So I'm only going to put that down at $6 million, but it is certainly something that does tend to happen. Once things get sufficiently large, it makes sense for you to start to hide costs within that bucket. And then finally, something that is certainly plausible, it's definitely within the realm of possibility that Sony is applying the acquisition cost of Firewalk Studio to the cost of Concord. They bought Firewalk Studio for Concord, more than anything else. There wasn't really anything else coming along with it. Basically, what Sony was getting with the Firewalk Studio acquisition was Concord and the people. It would make a lot of sense to apply the cost of acquiring the studio to the cost of the project that was supposed to be the future of Sony and make all of this money back super fast. Now, I don't know what Sony actually paid for Firewalk Studio. I'm using $100 million, which is certainly possible. It could be lower. It could be significantly higher, depending on how everyone was interpreting what was going on at the moment of acquisition. I wouldn't think that for a studio as young as Firewalk Studio, it would go much above $100 million. But given the importance that was being placed in this project, $100 million also does seem like a reasonable bottom end. But I'm not sure. So if we apply these three things, a 2016 to 2018 cost bucket, some amount of hidden costs, and adding the acquisition cost of Firewalk Studios into the costs of the overall project, then this lets us pull these numbers down quite significantly. It takes the average team size from 2018 to alpha all the way down to 130, which means we're probably peaking in the low 200s, which is a lot more plausible than something well above 300. And it takes that surge from alpha to launch from 900 down to 650, which is super duper within the realm of possibility. Now, one thing that is worth thinking about is whether or not that fully loaded staff month makes sense once all that surge is going on. Once you're drawing in devs from all across Sony and you're outsourcing like mad, does it still make sense to have as high of a fully loaded staff month cost as $15,000 a month? I think it does. Yeah, you're going to be bringing on some cheaper teams. You're going to be going to some of the cheaper outsourcing locations. But if you're going as big as this, you're also going to be bringing on some of the co-dev partners within the outsourcing community, and they're not cheap. They're very expensive. They'll be actually usually above $15,000 a staff month to outsource with them. I think it makes sense to hold that $15,000 a staff month cost even when we're huge, just because of inefficiencies and also because of high variability in the individual dev costs when we start going this big. I came into this exercise actually initially thinking that it wasn't even remotely plausible that Concord cost $400 million. But when I sat down and did the math, especially once you start applying in a few externalities for cost, yeah, it actually does start to look like that number makes a lot of sense. And we actually have other knobs that we could turn. We could turn that staff month cost up to $20,000 per staff month. Again, we're in Bellevue, Washington, so it's very expensive to have people there. Maybe Firewalk Studios bought a brand new building when they were founded, and that cost was integrated into the Concord costs. Maybe there were some other shenanigans involving licensing of IP that was in the process of being generated. There are potentially tens of millions of dollars from additional places that we could find in order to add on to the cost of this project. Makes a lot of sense. Did Sony get its money worth? Obviously not. The game lasted 2 weeks, but you can start to see how a project that runs as long as this one did, with a team as big as it sounds like they had, can start to get really expensive. One of the most expensive things a project can do when it's at full size is go late. If you already have 300 people on the team, then when you go late 1 month, when you have a $15,000 staff month cost, that's $4.5 million. So every month you go at that team size is costing you $4.5 million. If your team size is well above 300, if it's 500 or 600 or 700, then those costs go up even higher. It sounds like what happened with Concord is that there was a well-crafted story about the future of gaming, about live services being done in a different way, about integrated storytelling in live services. All of this is eerily familiar to me which is something we will talk about at a future date. So did it cost $400 million? I'm not sure. I think we can make it plausible that it did. Certainly for a game with this relatively small scope, it's hard to see where all of that money went. It would have had to have been lost in iteration. It would have had to have been lost in inefficiencies due to team structure or massive team sizes. Like we just went through, I think you can make the math work, and it might represent reality. It's also possible that the sources that are providing this number are exaggerating or misinformed or are getting their math wrong in some other way. So I'm certainly a lot more willing to believe this number than I was before I started this exercise. I still don't know for sure that $400 million is the actual number. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon if you're more comfortable supporting the channel in that way. Either way, I would definitely thank you for any support you can provide. If you're not looking to support the channel monetarily, think about giving it a like or putting a comment down below. That also indicates to the algorithm that it's worth sharing to more people. We also have merch. This is the Control the Triage, Control the Project shirt, and this is the High Tea and the High Seas hoodie. Those will be tagged in the video as well. Do you buy it? Do you think that Concord actually cost $400 million? Can you kind of follow the math in terms of how the project likely got there? My bet is that there are some big ticket items being tacked onto the price tag, pulling that 400 down to more like 275, 280 when you take those out, which is still really high, but I certainly think it's plausible. I certainly actually now think it's probable after going through this exercise. Let's talk about this down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.